So I want to thank Dr. Peter Levine for this interview on the evolution of somatic psychology in his work. Peter, thank you so much for joining us at the Embodied Psychology Summit.
Okay, glad to be here. I guess if I'm here, happier. I think half in the North Atlantic at 36,000 feet, but
the joys of jet lag. So thank you so much. So I wanted to start with the question of how you have seen the field of psychology evolve through your career.
Yeah. I guess I have to start with somewhere. So maybe with Freud. And Freud originally, because he was a very charismatic figure, there were other people working around the same period that I think were much more spot on, but he was the one that was really the promoter. And so he started with trauma. And he actually, in 1916, he proposed the following definition of trauma, which I think is absolutely spot on. I just made one little addition, one little tweak on it. So what little memory I have remembers this. He said that trauma is a breach in the protective barrier against stimulation, leading to feelings of overwhelming helplessness. The only thing I would change is that trauma is a breach in the protective barrier against overstimulation, leading to feelings of overwhelming helplessness. But then, of course, Freud went from this idea of trauma, which really was the person who was really leading that field at the time were Charcot, and God, what was his name? Help me. Pierre Janet, working at Salpierre in Paris. So I can see why he maybe was pressured to make this change, Freud, because he was really showing that the children of lawyers and bankers and doctors were sexually abusing their children, in a significant amount. And I imagine the pressure on him was so strong that this is not the only reason, but this, I believe, is one of the reasons that he then really switched tracks to that it was due to inner conflicts, the so-called Oedipal complex, where the child had a sexual attraction to the parent of the opposite sex. At that time was his, understanding. And that these impulses were forbidden. So they had to be suppressed, repressed, which led to the repression theories. And I think in doing that, he really abandoned his patients, many of his patients who he'd been working with, and really set the stage for you talking about evolution to a devolution, to devolution. But then I think it started to come back again to understanding the discrete nature or the different nature of trauma than so-called Oedipal conflicts, Oedipal impulses. And, and again, I don't say he's 100% wrong there. This is an element, but it became binary. It's either this or that. Not that it's mostly, trauma is when something happens that really overwhelms us, that triggers our nervous system into a loop of hyper and hypo arousal. But, the physiology, the neurology and the physiology at that time, was not evolved, not nearly evolved enough the way it is now today. So anyhow, so we went from the Oedipal complexes, I think probably around the late 40s into early 50s, the pendulum, which pendulums will do, swung to a more behavioral, so that you could observe the person's behavior and you could change the behavior by either reinforcement or operant conditioning. So So then this went on for some time, and it really led to some really drastic problems. For example, in the 1940s and even into the 50s, parents and mothers were told, first of all, not to have a natural childbirth, and then not to breastfeed the infant because it was unsanitary. I mean, you know, can you believe this? And if the infant was crying, was in distress, not to pick up the infant, the baby, because then the baby would learn to manipulate you. You know, so if you wanted independent children, you just left them alone. Now, there are times when you want to be able to let the child cry it out for a certain amount of time, but only after they built the capacity for being held and being, you know, connected. So then it switched again to more cathartic therapies. And this was Wilhelm Reich's student, Alexander Lowen, was the primary person. Of course, Reich was the one again who looked at trauma as it was held in the body. And also, again, he had some tremendously important insights, but I think he also got a little bit stuck with the idea also that Freud had, what do I want to say? That with Reich, all of the neurosis was a damming up of sexual energy. But in terms of trauma, you could say it's a damming up of survival instincts, a thwarting of survival instincts. So again, you see things going swinging. That's the way things just appears to be one of the laws of the universe, that whatever you think is wrong here, you're going to go to the other polarity, which is going to seem right until it seems wrong. And then you go to the other polarity. And then around, oh my gosh, probably you could say around the 80s, trying to think when Daniel Shore's book came out. Yeah, I think it was in the 80s and 90s for sure, where people, theorists, and clinicians were starting to look at some of the neurobiological findings. And again, I think this is really important. Unfortunately, neurobiologists and clinicians rarely actually meet and intersect with each other. There is some leakage, if you like, you know, between the two. And I think really the first time I had a feeling that this was a possibility and really led to a coherent development of trauma and understanding of neurobiological basis of trauma and putting in a framework that could be taught. And so in 1978, chance acquaintance, Stephen Porges, and I had read an article that he wrote about ADHD. And while that wasn't my interest, there was some mathematical things that he did that were very interesting to me, very important to me. And so I found out where at the university, I don't know how people did things before mobile phones, but you call operators and information. And finally I got to talk to him, and I sent him a copy of my dissertation, my thesis, which was on accumulated stress, reserve capacity, and dis-ease. So anyhow, he said, oh, we have to meet. And I said, I know we have to meet. He said, well, I said, I'll even fly out to Illinois, Champaign, Illinois. And he said, well, actually, next week, I'm going on a sabbatical at UCLA. So I was living in Berkeley at the time, so I flew down to LA from San Francisco, and we met in the airport. There's a whole story there if you have some more time, but I'll skip over it for now. And we probably talked for 8 hours straight, walking around the whole campus. And since then, we've always been bonded. One of the things I told him from my clinical work, as well as from my theoretical dissertation, was that that trauma could exist. Even the word trauma really wasn't used at that time, but we would now call trauma, had basically two forms. One was the sympathetic hyperarousal, in other words, the fight or flight response. And the other, which I was uncovering clinically, was that there were situations where the person has both a high sympathetic charge and even a higher parasympathetic charge. And so I told that to Steve, and he said, Peter, that's impossible. It can't be. I said, look, here's the you read it. This is a diagram from my dissertation. And these are my clinical observations. Remember, we talked at one of the earlier times about Nancy, how she went from hyper arousal to deep shutdown and then back up, and, you know. So then I think it was in 1994, we still had contact with each other. And the polyvagal theory just was published for the first time. This was 92, I think it was 94. And it was 100% clear that there are two vagal systems, one involved in social engagement in the front part of the brainstem, and the other one in the back having to do with shutdown. And then, you know, I was really able to use that to really clarify what I was teaching, because I still it didn't make sense. If the parasympathetic system was about relaxation, how could the parasympathetic system be causing so many physical, emotional, psychological problems? And again, the polyvagal theory, you know, really was that foundation. But more than that, in a way, it was an example of what happens when clinicians and theoreticians cooperate. Now, it was a little bit different because my background was also in neurobiology. And when I was doing my doctoral work, it was in the Department of Medical and Biological Physics. And basically, I was studying neurophysiology, mathematics, physics, and so forth. So, you know, at least I had language, I could communicate. But the dialogue and the co-development of our work is so deeply important. And Stephen and I are still we're like brothers, you know, colleagues, brothers, more like brothers. And we've kept in contact for all of these years. So, okay, so that's taking trauma back, you know, sort of in the neurobiological realm, and a clinical approach to being able to change those internal experiences, which is the process which in 1986 I called somatic experiencing. Before that, it was something like trauma resolution therapy or something, or no, stress resolution therapy. So okay, so let's go back to the mainstream in psychology. I hope I'm not flipping-flopping too much. My inhibitory system is not working that well. So psychology, again, you had really cathartic approaches stemming from the brilliant work, and he's one of the giants, the giant shoulders that I stand upon. And then Alexander Lowen. And a lot of this was on emotional release. It was sort of, you had this stored pool of crap, and you needed to drain the swamp. And that's what the emotions were supposed to do. But I had the opportunity to meet Al Lowen, and actually a couple of times. I met him in New York, but then he came out to California, so I was there for his workshop. And we were all laying on the floor, twisting towels, yelling, "Mother, mother, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you." I mean, really. And okay, so now, fast forward a little bit to when I'm teaching at Esalen. I was living at Esalen teaching in a program called the Visiting Scholars Program. And one of the things that I noticed is there was a cathartic approach that was going on there. And but my job to pay for my room and board, basically, would be to twice a week do a group which was open to the community and to seminarians. And so I would just sit, usually between 15 and 25 people would come, and we'd sit down, and I would start working with them in the way that I was developing somatic experiencing, which was a very gentle, titrated approach. And what was interesting is when the group that I worked with on Monday, I think it was Monday and Thursday, when they came in, they would immediately go into this catharsis. Then on the Thursdays, it was much less. I was actually able to work with a person, work with some of the issues they were dealing with in a productive way. And this went on for a while. Finally, I realized something is really strange going on here. So anyhow, I was walking to the dining room one day for lunch, and there's a bulletin board there, for announcements. And I noticed there was an announcement that this cathartic group approach was not going to be done on, it was going to be switched from Wednesday to Friday. And interestingly, when it was on Friday, the Thursday group would again go right into these catharses. So at that time, and then I would also follow people. So seminarians, they would come and, and writhe and scream. And then they would come back some months later and do exactly the same. And then again, the next year and do exactly the same. It's like they were really stuck. But the therapy was, in a way, was keeping them stuck. So, anyhow, this is a time when I was really getting the grist of working on, on this approach and in teaching the approach. And the question is not, it was, again, I think it was sort of a throwback to the Freudian idea that that our parents are the cause of our problems. And if we get out that primal pain, then we'll be okay. And again, I want to make sure, deep emotional work is important, but it doesn't need to be overwhelming, nor should it be overwhelming. We do have pain, we do have abandonment, but we more have to know how to deal with it in the here and now rather than regress. So I saw my work more as going to the areas where people got stuck and progressing forward into a mature adult life, but with a rich inner child landscape. And so again, I was then starting to develop, somatic experiencing. And at the time, people were, well, I would say they were not more than suspicious of me. Sometimes I would give lectures and there'd be maybe some psychiatrists, and they would just get up and go out the room. Some started to advise patients, not to work with me, not to see me because I was doing this harmful work. I mean, I can speak of it, now, but at the time it was crushing because I knew that I had something that was vitally important. And it was painful for me to see how it was being construed, how it was being misunderstood. But, I kept at it. Sometimes a very lonely path. And then I started teaching a group of Berkeley therapists, a really bright group of people. And we would meet once or twice a week. We called it my tree house in Wildcat Canyon. I had this house that was literally right in the canyon. It was kind of an amazing place. They would come and I would work with people in the group, and then I would try, with their help, to dissect what had happened. And we worked together, you know, for at least a year or two. I think it was about more like 2 years. And when I think about where SE is now, that's really my impression, that I'm there with those 12 or 15 people, you know, and it was incomprehensibly when somebody said to me, you know, Peter, your work has now been taught to 50,000 people in 42 different countries. And I just couldn't get my head around it. And so to the question I asked myself, have I done enough in this lifetime? I can say, yes, I have done enough. Whether I am enough, that's another situation. But it became really widely recognized. And there was still some resistance. Certainly there was around mainstream people. But now, here we are in 2020. So I noticed around 2005, there seemed to be a shift. And more people who are in more conventional areas were starting to study with me and some of the other teachers. And they were from fields like with cognitive behavior therapy, analytic therapy, psychodynamic therapies, all different therapies. What's one of the things about SE is that it really enhances people's work in whatever field they are. It doesn't say you have to give up what you're doing to learn this. It really is let this, you know, fortify and extend the work that you're already doing. And, you know, from feeling, you know, unrecognized, starting in 2010, I did receive 4 Lifetime Achievement Awards. It was quite a shift, quite a shift. The first one was from the U.S. Association of Body Psychotherapists for my contribution to bringing trauma into somatic work, or somatic work into trauma. Then I received a couple of lifetime awards for my work with children and infants. But then this last year, when was it? March? Yes, it was in March. I received the award from the Psychotherapy Networker, which is really much more in the mainstream. And when I gave my acceptance speech, their journal had a picture of a person that was made up of a jigsaw puzzle, but a big piece of it was out. And it said, the missing piece, the body. So I think at this point, there's no going back. You know, I think we've found that middle ground, which is not, not strictly behavioral. It's not cathartic, although it has some elements of both, really. But it's something, again, quite different, and in some ways revelatory in understanding the human condition, and in working with human suffering, with healing suffering. And I see that even more than just the trauma of PTSD. That's just one small part of what we work with clinically. We work with people who are in distress, who are in pain, and trauma is certainly very likely to be part of it. But really what's fundamental is they're cut off from people's own life energy, from their life force, from their own vitality. And to me, healing is about restoring one's vitality, the élan vital, as the French call it. And that has to be the end goal. If you say that there's a goal, is to become more alive, more vital. And you have to work with the body if that's your intention, if that's your goal.
Thank you, Peter. I'm wondering if you can talk about a little bit more about the body, because for some of us, who grew up in psychology in the last 20 years, it's perhaps more familiar, but still for others, the concept of the body can be still kind of a mechanical idea. What does that, what does that mean to work with the body?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, this is really about the anatomical body on one hand, which is important, very important. On the other hand is the living body, the knowing, sensing body. And there's a very alien concept in psychology, that how could a body have wisdom? The living, knowing body. Bodies don't know things, only the brain, the mind knows things. The body knows things that are so important and so precious. And when people contact that, really their lives change. They're not governed by external sources, but rely on their internal sensing. So again, this was a concept that that really just didn't exist in psychology. And I think that's the missing piece. It's not just, but you have to know anatomy, you have to know physiology to some degree in order to work effectively. But again, it's not just the anatomical body. Yeah, I forget what the words are, but in German, they have two different words for body. One refers to the physical body and the other one to the living body. So, and again, these were known in ancient, traditional and ancient yogic practices, meditation practices, spiritual practices, shamanic practices. And one of the things that I was accused of, but now I accept as a badge of honor, is that what I was doing was shaman work. And, but at the time, I wanted to prove my detractors wrong, that this was scientifically based and was transmissible, in a Western context. So in a way, I had to not exactly deny, but I had to push that shamanistic, again, talking about giant shoulders. I had the opportunity to visit different shamans throughout the world and to have dialogues with them. And it was clear to me from that my work was much closely aligned to shamanic understanding than it was from psychological. But again, in somatic experiencing, we hold those together and have a great debt of attitude to the shamans who have done healing by helping. Well, they do it somewhat differently. If you think about this, when a person has been highly traumatized, they dissociate. And shamans, when they work with trauma, what they'll do is they'll go into a trance. They may or may not use different substances, different plant substances as catalysts. And they will travel to where the person's soul has left. And then they will use it with song and chanting. They will bring the person's soul back into the body. And again, they do it with different kind of practices. So while SE was similar in certain ways, it was rather different, because instead of the therapist, the shaman, going to and retrieving the dissociated part, the soul loss, as trauma is called in shamanism, and again, singing it back into the body, we guide the client to do that. But again, the relationship is quite intertwined between shamanic understanding. And actually I'm working on, some people have been kind of pushing me in this direction, writing an autobiography where I talk about how I've been able to integrate shamanic wisdom with neurophysiology, neurobiology, and clinical practice. And again, I'm able to kind of pull back, and because now I have 40 excellent teachers who are teaching the work worldwide. And so, I still do certain classes, master classes, and I have engagement with my faculty. But, I'm at a different stage in my life. And that requires more kindness to myself, actually. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question or even what the question was, but.
Well, we were talking about the body, and you did answer it
Body.
in differentiating the sort of biomechanical body or the neuromechanical body versus the living consciousness that we refer to as the body. And so I want to, now that you've differentiated that, I think it's helpful to go back to what you were saying before, that your work was about integrating trauma in the body, or the body into trauma, right, with this understanding that it wasn't just from a neurobiological perspective. Yeah. It was also about this innate intelligence of the body that you were weaving back.
Exactly. The innate intelligence and how we lose it in trauma. One of my most important discoveries, in a way, very simple, is that when trauma happens, it's not something that just happens in the brain or the mind. It's something very specifically, I think we talked about this before, that happens in the body. So the body then holds these feelings of fear, of helplessness, of overwhelming helplessness. And it stays there in the body until the body has new experiences that contradict and differentiate the experience of trauma in the body, that lead towards experiences of empowerment and mastery. So, and again, without changing the experience in the body, you fundamentally can't change trauma. I mean, you can try to help people change their thoughts, their negative beliefs. You can explain to them why they're having the trauma, but really nothing changes until it changes in the body. And I later called it, and I think other people also would call it, making similar in different fields, of bottom-up processing. So again, even if you could change the person's thoughts and give them an insight onto their trauma, it's very unlikely that it would change that very much. So, anyhow, the idea of transforming trauma became really essentially understanding the body and the living body. And again, understanding the physical body, the anatomical body, the neurobiological body, and the experiential body. And by being able to change those experiences, then they contradicted the traumatic experiences of fear and overwhelming helplessness. You can't have both at the same time. It's going to be one or the other. And this comes from talk about neurophysiology, from Sir Charles Sherrington's work, for which he received the Nobel Prize in, I don't know, 1928, I think, something like that. And he realized that the musculature is made up of contradicting impulses. So for example, when I pick up this cup with my tea, in order to do that, I have to contract my biceps muscle. And then when I put it down, I gently contract my triceps muscle. Now, if I didn't, so when I'm lifting, the bicep muscle then inhibits the tricep muscle, because if not, I would be coming up like this and splashing my face with with tea. Well, like you saw recently with the president trying to drink a glass of water. So unless you're, if they're locked together, you're in an anxiety state. So in Sherringtonian terms, in order to get smooth functioning, you had to inhibit the reciprocal contraction. Okay, so the same goes for trauma. When we are able to change that internal experience, then the trauma wanes, it fades, it transforms. So I think that's, again, one of the important understandings that comes from the field of body psychotherapy, and if I might say so myself, of also, in somatic experiencing. And again, one of the things that I see is many, many, many fields now are incorporating somatic experiencing. I mean, some give deference, but it's okay, some don't. But again, it gives me this feeling now that it's out and people are, whatever, they're making some variation and putting their name on it. But it's, again, what do they say, the horse is out of the barn, or the cows haven't got back into the barn, or something like that. That, again, these ideas now are universal. But then going back to people like Pierre Genet and who else would be an important person there? Rivers. He wrote a book on instinct. So these things were, again, historical there. And it was sort of like when I discovered their work, I realized that, oh my gosh, there's nothing completely new under the sun, because there isn't. I couldn't, from the reading, I couldn't get an understanding of what the therapy consisted of. That really wasn't written about. But still, if you think about it, what I'm doing now really had its roots 100, 120 years ago. And again, so on those, the shoulders of those giants, I'm proud to stand on.
Thank you. So one of the phrases you used was the experiential body, in terms of, which is different than, let's say, the understanding it from the experiential perspective versus the neurobiological perspective. And one of the things I've heard you speak towards, which I'd love to talk more about, is the difference between observing the experiential body and actually feeling inhabited or in contact with the experience itself.
Yeah. Right. When people first begin to connect with the experiential body, by the way, another person who is deserving of accolades here is Jean Genlin. And we're sort of friends. We got together and spent some time together. But in coining the term felt sense, he gave a number of us who were working in body psychotherapy at the time a good language, a useful language, and words matter, and it was very important. And so the experiential body is somewhat like the felt sense body. So it's in SU, we talk about it as an mixture of sensations, of inner images, of behaviors, of affects, emotions, and feelings, and of meaning. And that gives us a sense of continuity. Where am I? So when people first start to contact the experiential body, it's often revelatory. It's like, wow, this really changes how the world works. And so that's that recognition, that insight. But then the next step is for that to become embodied, just having the experience is, of course, it's essential, but then to embody it. And one of the things in somatic experiencing that I'm really pushing wouldn't be the word, that I'm really encouraging, is at the very beginning to do more with the students on what embodiment really means, how you take these experiential learnings, how you make them as part of your body, part of who you are. Yeah.
Could you give us an example of that process, of this embodiment process?
Okay. You know, as children, as infants, when we're under stress or exposed to trauma, we lose contact with our bodies, because our bodies were the battlefield where these things occurred. So we dissociate or we shut down. And it's not like water faucets. You know, once you turn it on, it's on. And so when you turn it off, you don't have any feelings. And many traumatized people walk around either overwhelmed by emotion or just shut down and numb. And so when the body begins to thaw, then that richness begins to be restored. But how to make that part of a permanent fixture in our bodies, I think that's what you're referring to, or certainly what we're both referring to in terms of embodiment, and how vitally important embodiment is. And again, that's nothing new. Although if you kind of, and again, I'm a total amateur at this, but if you actually look back in history and look at art and sculpture, it seems to me that there was, me again, amateur art historian, I mean really amateur, that there was a time, you know, in the late Egyptian, early Greek period, particularly also of the Cycladic period in Greek development, by looking at their sculptures and how they form the body, you know, it's really quite extraordinary. So I think there was that few 100-year period when human beings were embodied. And then, whoop, after that.
Yeah, I think we see that in many different traditions in which there was a focus on liberation through the body as opposed to liberation from the body.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, liberation through the body.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because the body is what holds all our feelings, what gives us a sense of empowerment, of vitality, and strength. It's not, I'm not just talking about, you know, doing chin-ups and push-ups, but really feeling a sense of increased capacity to meet the challenges of life and to be fortified by them.
Another example I was thinking of when you were speaking was the difference between sort of recognizing our vitality, since you used that word earlier, versus actually experiencing the qualities of vitality, of what it is to taste, to smell, to hear in our own self the experience of being more fully alive.
Yeah, right. You know, it's like when you wake up one morning and you go outside and you notice a blade of grass with little droplets of dew on it. And you are just filled with something. I mean, objectively, it's just a droplet of water, can explain in terms of surface tension, you know, nothing mystical about it. But when you see it through fresh eyes, and you just feel your chest open and your belly warm by seeing this, those are the qualities, some of the qualities of vitality. And, you know, again, if you tried to describe it just physically or physically neurophysiologically, how that image then goes into certain parts of the brain and, you know, and so forth, is obviously something quite much greater than that, much bigger than that. And so those are kind of qualities of vitality, of aliveness. You know, you meet somebody you haven't seen for a while, and again, your chest is filled with gladness, and you move together towards them. I mean, social distancing, you know, before and will be after. We see the person and we just want to share what's been happening with us and listening to what they're sharing. Again, you can look at this factually, that this is what's happening, but it's happening from a foundation of vitality. You know, this, when we see our friend, when we see the blade of grass and the dew, we let those in. We see them visually, but we take them in. And instead of just being registered in our visual cortex, they're registered throughout the brain, especially the feeling parts of the brain, and in our bodies.
I feel you framing psychology in a different way than is typically examined or taught, which is the difference between more of a traditional psychology perspective being more like you're evaluating disease or wrongness versus the technology or process of returning to vitality.
Right.
Enhancing vitality.
Yeah. You know, rather than looking at what's wrong with the person or exclusively, which is very much a psychological, you know, approach. What's wrong and how can we fix it? But in somatic experience, we look really primarily at what's right with the person. And sometimes I see people with the most horrendous trauma histories. I mean, I have my own significant ones, but I work with people who have orders of magnitude more destructive. And I wonder, when they come to see me, I'll sometimes ask, when you told me and we went over some of your trauma history, you know, I thought it was quite miraculous that you're able to come here and to be here. And I wonder if you would be willing to share with me some of what got you from there to here. And sometimes I hear rather remarkable stories, which again helps me to understand and relate to the person about what was right, but not only what was wrong with them. Again, you do have to have some understanding, I think, of psychopathology and pathologies in general. You know, you have to know a little bit of physiology. But ultimately, we really are wanting to find out how the person was able to get from a very destructed childhood to being able to function, and then to take the next step. But we take the next step from what's right for the person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think, you know, there's that question of how, as a practitioner or how as another human being, do we sit with someone? Do we be present with someone in the bigness of their experience? And I hear you naming that as sort of the ground to be present with someone, which is such a healing process.
Yep, important point. To be present with another person. What does that assume or preclude? I mean, no, not assume. What does that assume? It's assuming that we're present with ourselves, within ourselves. And in our trainings, we really work with the students to know when they're present and know when they're, especially when they're not present, and to be able to become present. One of the classes that I gave last year in Europe, I think it was in Europe, was presence, connection, and intuition. Because when we're able to be present in ourselves and then be present with the individual, then we start being able to work together. You know, as Alan Shore says, from the right, you know, right brain functions from, you know, from client and therapist. But really, when we're able to experience presence to help the clients become more present, and then having this unfolding where your intuition informs you. I mean, by the way, intuition is not something that's magical or mystical. It's based on a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience. It basically allows you, instead of going through all of your memory banks, it lets you get to it almost instantaneously in terms of what again, the living body. It gives us, this is where we need to go right now. And if you don't have experience, again, in the training, we do so much of getting people to have these experiences, to understand them. But if you don't have it, it's not going to, you know, you're not going to be able to do it. So so you have to practice a lot. You really, really have to practice. You know, like the guy who was looking for Carnegie Hall, and he asked the taxi driver, "How do you get there?" And he said, "Practice, practice, practice." Really practice until it becomes embodied, until it becomes second nature. And also when we're working with clients, I just did a supervision about countertransference. Very often we're working with the person and all of a sudden something happens and we're blank. Often it's around issues around shame. And so that's then a signal for us as therapists and as human beings to work on our own stuff, which then allows us to be even more present with that person and with other people. So it's a constantly co-evolving. And I don't think therapists would be able really to evolve, you know, without having clients. I think they, in a way, take us to our limitations. And some take us to our limitations in a way that, you know, makes us want to pull our hair out. But still, if we understand it in terms of a positive evolution, then we're able to respond to our client, to ourselves and to our clients in a different way.
One of the things I like to say in response to the intuition, that intuition is the language of our consciousness, and the body as the sort of the transcriber of consciousness, or
yeah. You know, I think there's a Sufi saying, "The body is the shore on the ocean of being."
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly where we want to position ourselves. We don't want to say the body is everything, but without the body, at least when we're alive, there is nothing. And even, you know, I've even worked with, for examples, with paraplegics or even quadriplegics, who had more feeling than many people, other people, so-called healthy people. And but when I worked with them, I would see how much of their face they're using for reference, because many of them have, you know, they're literally, you know, physically cut off from large parts of their body, but they can really inhabit the parts that are not paralyzed. And I've been humbled in working with people who are quads and paraplegics.
I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit. That, by the way, that is pretty. That I feel like that's a really important subject that maybe it's worth spending a little more time on. is the sort of privilege of the body. When we talk about in somatic work, the privileging to be able to feel the whole body versus what you're referring to is wherever we can.
Yeah. 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 Well, it's an awakening.
Yeah.
You know, and there are two states, awakening and sleeping. Awakening and sleep. You know, Leber's talked about lucid dreaming. And I think we can also talk about lucid awakening.
I like that.
You know, and I think this was an idea that man I knew, Dick Olney, came up with. Yeah, you know, and often being able to, because when we're awake, we're with our regular body that I put on my shirt and my vest with. And what was the question again?
We were looking at sort of the, you know, we talk about the body, the soma. And,
oh, yes. Okay, I know where I am now. Yeah. Well, you know, when we're asleep, then we have what Arnie Mundell called the dream body. It's the body that's asleep. It's the things that are going on in our bodies, often that haven't been resolved or that are moving towards new frontiers, but we're not there yet. And so our dreams may take us in that direction. And but then how do we then integrate the dreams into the waking life? And you know, and Jung and his followers were very much about working with dreams. You know, actually, when I'm in Zurich, I, you know, when in Rome, you know, I work with a Jungian analyst here, and dreams are really quite miraculous when you take them seriously. And they need to be taken seriously, but lightly. But lightly. So again, you're taking what the body is doing when it's not awake into what the body needs to be evolving to when it is awake, when it's in the state of wakefulness.
Are you referring to the same wakefulness or waking as in that you referred to before in trauma in terms of awakening into our vitality?
Yes, you know, remember, trauma is when tremendous amount of activation occur to such a degree that we're overwhelmed. But that activation is energy. And the question is, how do we contact the energy through our work with the trauma? Again, the energy, well, it's probably, arguably, somewhat similar to the traditions like of Kundalini yoga.
And non-dual tantric.
And non-dual tantric, yeah. Those kind of things. Because when you're in a state of threat, you need to mobilize the maximum amount of energy that's possible. But then when we become traumatized, that energy is all there. It's all dressed up, but with nowhere to go. So when we're working with those energies around trauma, or even just other forms of body psychotherapy, we are visiting those realms, you know, and of that high activation. But by titrating it, by opening to it just a small amount at a time, we then are able to embody that energy. And that energy is aliveness, whether it's fight or flight aliveness, or whether it's being aliveness, the aliveness of being. What was that film? The unbearable lightness of being, right? But it has to be bearable, the bearable lightness of being. That might be it.
I think that's such an important reframe too of elements of trauma, in that sense, where these energies are just flavors of our aliveness.
Yeah.
And when that flavor, that experience, or that energy of aliveness is stagnated or overloaded, that's where we see it. And I think that it's such an important reframe to come back to, that the intentionality of that energy is actually not intended as anything but energy itself.
Yeah. You know, I mean, when our parents, with all their failings, combine their DNA, you know, that was the gift of aliveness.
Yeah.
And we're always searching for it, to return to the source, like the salmon. And how we do it is our own particular journey, as well as our own archetypal and universal journey. I think that might be a good place to leave it.
I think that's a pretty profound place to leave it, Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your wisdom and sharing this journey with us.